Well, I'm delighted to be with you and eager to get into this subject. Hopefully, we'll not only be able to get some ideas across that you will find helpful, but that when we get a chance to interact with them in a question and answer session, that any challenges you feel to what I have stated will be addressed in that time where you have the opportunity to raise a question, and we can dialogue on that a little bit. As I was standing there, I was thinking of the humorous story of this man for whom English was now a new language, and he was trying to use all of his best words. So he looked at this man and he said, every time I try to come up with a new word, my tongue-ui gets twisted up. And the man said, that's not tongue-ui, I should tell you that's pronounced tongue. He said, there you go again. The way you spell your words, everything just seems so vague-y each time I try to use it. So the man said, well, I got news for you. It's really not vague-y, it's vague. Maybe I should give you a law about the English language. Whenever you see a ui at the end of a word, it is silent. So it's not tongue-ui, it's tongue. It's not vague-ui, it's vague. The fellow said, okay, let's not argue about it. Do you ever get the feeling that just when you think a philosophy has put us in a place where we can address the challenges of our time, some new possibility comes which strains our ethical norms? Who would have ever envisioned that a few decades ago, or would we have thought a few decades ago, of the questions we'd be dealing with in our time? All the way from human sexuality to the nature of marriage and even genetics and stem cell research and all of that. These things are getting very, very complex. And even people who think they've got a worldview or an epistemological base from which they can make these judgments, suddenly when they hear a new issue or a new qualification introduced, they have to take a step back and wonder how they're going to address this tangled subject with meaning and with coherence. As we wrestle with these issues and face them head on, you see two worldviews actually in conflict. First is the very nature of truth. Somewhere deep in all of our worldviews and our thinking, whatever your worldview may be, at some stage, you have to come to the conclusion that the truth does matter, especially when you're on the receiving end of a lie. You come to the conclusion that the truth does matter. I recall my wife and children and I, when we were living in England for some time, going into the Old Bailey, that great hall of justice. And unknown to us, as we walked into the middle of a proceeding of a case, we were not aware that this was going to be the trial of a man who was accused of raping two little girls. I think they're about 11 or 12 or something like that. And so being minors, they were not in the courtroom. But from where we were positioned in the balcony, you could barely get a glimpse of them on the television monitor where the prosecutor and the lawyer could see them while they were asking them questions. The jurors couldn't see them, and the accused was also unable to gain sight of them. As the question and answer was going back and forth, I recall at one moment as the prosecutor brought his charges that this incident had supposedly taken place a year or a year and a half before and laid the groundwork of all that had transpired. The anger building up within me, thinking, how could a man like that have actually victimized two little girls like this? Answering in such innocence, answering in such soft tones. And after his prosecutorial task was complete, the lawyer defending the man stood up. And he started to weave his case very, very gently, but very, very determinedly. And what he was trying to do was to establish that this incident actually never happened. It was a collusion between two of them when the man had seen them in a different setting on a particular day and threatened to come and tell the girl's parents that evening of where he had seen them. And so that evening, prior to this man getting to the parents, these two girls came back from school and accused him of having raped them several months before. And as these two arguments were unfolding, I remember sitting there thinking to myself, what is going on here? What am I to make of this? If this man has indeed violated these two little girls, what a heinous crime it is. And is this defense lawyer up to some tricks to manufacture a situation which actually then places the blame on these two little girls? Is this an old courtroom trick he's up to? And I remember as we walked out of there, not one of us was convinced that we actually knew what the truth was. Now tell me something. In that one incident in life, it became imperative that we understood what actually happened. If that is true of one incident in life, where a handful of people's lives are affected, how much more important it is that we understand the truth and know the source of truth about life's essence, life's meaning, and life's destiny. And so what I want to do, ladies and gentlemen, as you've come for this, obviously I don't speak to any audience where I think everybody's going to agree with what I'm saying. I don't expect that at all. But I do hope, whatever the differences, in a civil manner, we can engage one another and try to arrive at patterns and ways of thinking in which these issues can be addressed and answers can be forthcoming. And really, as I have these 3 nights here in your lovely city, tonight here, then tomorrow night at the Tabernacle, where I'm planning to present to you why I believe Jesus Christ to be the way, the truth, and the life, and the point of reference for all the answers to our most deep questions. And then on the final night, deal with one of the secular philosophies that surrounds us and challenge that philosophy in its foundations, again offering the counter perspective of the Christian faith. It was Winston Churchill who said this once in the middle of the war. He said, "The truth is the most valuable thing in the world. Indeed, it is so valuable that it is often protected by a bodyguard of lies." The truth is the most valuable thing in the world. Indeed, it is so valuable that it is often protected by a bodyguard of lies. He was, of course, talking about it in terms of warfare, where deceit and prevarications and all of those things are carried on in order to win over the enemy. It was Natan Sharansky, the then Minister of Trade and Justice in Israel, who went back to his home in Moscow, where he had been held in solitary confinement for many years at the Lefortovo prison. Just a few years ago, when they allowed him to come back to the former Soviet Union, he asked if he can go and sit in that room where he had spent so many years alone, where they tried to break him. He left his wife outside and said he wanted to be in that room alone for a few minutes. And then he allowed her to come in, and he said, "It was here that I actually discovered my soul." And he asked, as he came out of there, to take a wreath and lay it at the grave of the great physicist Andrei Sakharov, who had given to the Soviets the nuclear bomb. And as he laid the wreath, Sharansky made this comment. He said, before he died, Sakharov issued this statement. He said, "I've always thought that the most powerful weapon in the world was the bomb. And that's why I gave it to my people. But I've come to the conclusion that the most powerful weapon in the world is not the bomb. The most powerful weapon in the world is the truth." And so when you take it as the most valuable thing and the most powerful thing, that's on one side of the ledger. Then you come up against the shifting sands of our culture, especially Western culture, which is standing now on the quicksand of relativism, or to use the term of G.K. Chesterton, with its feet firmly planted in midair. How do we find the truth in times such as these? I want to help take us through 3 changes that have taken place somewhere in the last 20 to 25 years and point out to you how these ontic referents, points of reference for absolutes in three major moods have shifted. These moods have sort of come into our culture almost unawares, till the day dawns and we realize those moods are not just feelings that permeated our culture, but now have become convictions that hold us and have left us now with no points of reference on discovering the truth. And if you understand these three moods and these three social phenomena, you'll begin to see how important it is that here in North America, we come to terms with the ramifications of this. And then in the last few minutes, I will just propose to you why the transcendent Christian worldview, I believe, provides for us a legitimate answer to counter these moods and these shifting ideas with which we live. In the 1980s, Psychology Today had a lead article in which the writer Daniel Yankelevich was answering the question, finding fulfillment in the shifting moods of American life. And he defined culture then in these terms. Culture is the effort to provide a coherent set of answers to the existential situations that confront all human beings in the passage of their lives. Notice his definition, and he's actually borrowing it from the sociologist Daniel Bell. Culture is the effort to provide a coherent set of answers to the existential situations that confront all human beings in the passage of their lives. He has already smuggled in one test for truth, that there has to be a coherence within our culture if we are going to find meaningful answers to the existential questions that confront all of us in the passage of our lives. So he is dealing with this search for coherence. And he says America in the 80s is struggling with it and trying to find its way to coherence in the midst of these changes. But then he makes a remarkable comment. Here's what he says. A cultural revolution is one that makes a decisive break with the shared meanings of the past, particularly those that relate to the deepest questions of the purpose and nature of human life. So he's defined what culture is, and then he says a cultural revolution is underway when a decisive break has been made from the shared meanings of the past, particularly those meanings that deal with the significant questions of the purpose and nature of human life. And you see the ramifications of ideas such as these, that you and I are assumed today to have shared meanings from the past, that address the present. That's what will bring coherence as we search for answers to the existential questions. So a cultural revolution began. What was that revolution? I believe there were three principal ideas that were endemic in that revolution. First is what we call the process of secularization. Now let me define this. Secularization is the process by which religious ideas, institutions, and interpretations have lost their social significance. It is a process by which religious ideas, institutions, and interpretations have lost their social significance. Now, when you look back upon the last 20 to 25 years, you can see the impact secularization has had. What do I mean? If you were to watch a television program on a given night, and say the issue of some volatilely divisive matter is being discussed, whether it's sexuality or abortion or genetic engineering or whatever it is, and you see a panel of men and women well studied in the field, and you listen to a lawyer, you listen to a philosopher, you listen to a university president, you listen to a bioethicist, you listen to a geneticist, and you listen to a molecular biologist, you listen to some philosopher or psychologist, and in the middle of that panel is a pastor. Who do you think will be assumed by the listening audience to be the most prejudiced before this all began? It'll be the pastor. even if it's possible that the pastor's PhD is in ethics, while somebody on the panel there may have just read some popular books or articles in Reader's Digest on the subject, will be assumed to be completely objective if they're not religiously minded. Isn't it interesting? If you're religiously minded, you're assumed to be prejudiced. If you're irreligiously minded, you're assumed to be objective. I remember in the 1980s when I was living in Toronto, Canada, and Canada for 100 years, Toronto for 100 years had been known as Toronto the Good. It became branded as Toronto Good in the 1880s when the mayor of the city of Toronto at that time had determined that there was so much going on in the streets of Toronto that was not becoming of a decent city. And he decided to clean it up. And at the end of his first term, so thorough had been the job, and that he was swept into power again in his next election as the people were so proud of what he'd done. It then became branded as Toronto the Good. 100 years later, a mayor was running for the position in Toronto, and an issue of tremendous moral ramifications came up. And he said he was going to depart from the traditional way of looking at that moral matter, and he was going to take a rather radical stance on it. And his office was inundated by thousands of telephone calls. Thousands, if I remember, something like 20,000 telephone calls had been logged up in a few days. He went on television and made the comment that he was discounting those telephone calls because most of them had come from religiously minded people. And he said, and we all know they are predisposed and prejudiced on this subject. Some years ago, Atlanta was trying a well-known pornography entrepreneur. And in the witness stand, people were saying that his stuff was so deviant and so horrid and so abusive of human sexuality that it actually made Playboy magazine look quite acceptable. His was so far off the charts. But when they were selecting members for the jury in Atlanta, one of the things that the defense lawyer did not want was men and women who belonged to a church. And in the South, it took an awful long time for him to find somebody who didn't belong to a church. But once they got the jury settled, the lawyer had a marvelous trick up his sleeve. He looked at a person testifying against his client, and he said this: "Have you ever gone into an art gallery?" Answer, yes. Have you ever paid to go into an art gallery? Yes. Have you ever paid to go into an art gallery where there are paintings by the great masters of art? Yes. Have you ever paid to go into an art gallery by the great masters of art where there are unclothed people, where there are nude paintings of nude people displayed in the gallery? Yeah, I suppose so. Will you please explain now why you have, as the witness was on the stand and he was asking the witness this, please explain to this jury why you paid to go to an art gallery where there were paintings of disrobed people and you called that art and you call my client's stuff pornography. And how do you argue at that point? How do you say, can I first give you my worldview on art? You can't do it. But I remember thinking about that and sitting down and saying, you know, what would I say if I had this lawyer across a table for a cup of coffee and we started arguing this point? And there were two thoughts that came into my mind. The first thought was, I remembered reading the biography of Michelangelo. And when Michelangelo started to paint disrobed people, the unclothed human body, of all things as long ago as that, his teacher asked him one day, why are you doing this? And Michelangelo said, because I want to see man as God sees man. And the teacher said, Michael, you are not God. And in that simple response, he was trying to point out that there are proclivities within the human heart which, if we do not take into consideration, can even take that which is normally decent and pervert it in some way to stimulate the baser and the wrong instincts within our mind. But then I recalled the discussion that C.S. Lewis had in his marvelous book, A Pilgrim's Regress. If you haven't read that book, I encourage you to read it. His straightforward testimony of his conversion from atheism through the route of pantheism and even the possibility of Marxism into the Christian faith is straightforward, given to us in his book, Surprised by Joy. But in an allegoric form, it is given to us in the book, A Pilgrim's Regress. Now, he takes off on Bunyan's work, A Pilgrim's Progress, because Bunyan writes it sort of as he progresses along, going from place to place till he comes to that celestial city, and his burden is rolled away at the top of that hill. But in this instance, Lewis does not go that route. Lewis says, as I rejected philosophy after philosophy and option after option, I really didn't know why I was rejecting it till I found the person of Christ in my life, then took a regressive journey because I now had the answer to why I found those other options wrong. So it's in an allegorical form. And as he tells the story, he refers to himself as a young man called John. And he's winding himself through the options of life till he arrives at this mountain that he describes in the terms, the spirit of the age, where everything goes with the culture of the times. And he sees the one who heads the spirit of the age staring there grim and unhappy, which was rather indicative. You would think when you live by the spirit of the age, you'll have a kind of a beatific smile plastered on your face because it's hedonistic, you're enjoying everything there is to enjoy. He sees this as a grim, despondent, almost despair-oriented look. And with his Neronic stare, he's watching over those who are under his rulership. And he pictures himself bound in chains, not really free. Again, a kind of a contrary image. You'd think when you're living by the spirit of the age, you've got unmitigated freedom, but he sees himself actually as handcuffed. And then the waiter representing the head of the spirit of the age brings the breakfast and serves it to John. And John says he made the mistake of commenting on the delicious taste of the milk that was given to him for breakfast. And the man looks at him and says, you just call it milk. All it is the secretion of a cow, isn't it? Like it's urine or anything else, it is nothing but the secretion of a cow. And John just smarted, not knowing what to say. He says, then I made the bigger mistake of commenting on the tastiness of the eggs. He says, then you should have heard the description he gave me of what an egg really is. But he didn't know how to respond. He gulps it down, almost nauseated by thinking of it in the terms that the waiter had described it. And he says, as he sat saying, how do I respond to this man? He says this, reason came riding on a horse and rescued me. And as we were riding out of that mountain, he turns and says, you lie. You lie because you don't know the difference between what nature has meant for nourishment and what nature has meant for garbage. This is the tragedy of our culture today. With no points of reference anymore, we do not know the difference between what nature has meant for nourishment and what nature has meant for garbage or refuse. You see, ladies and gentlemen, the woman who sits in front of the lens of the cameraman peddling her in their pornographic empire somehow ought to stop and scream out and say, please don't do this to me. To stimulate the baser instincts of some insatiable man whose perversion is only going to drive him deeper and deeper into a handcuffed life, possibly taking away the sanctity and the delight of his very own marital life. Don't do this to me. But she won't refuse. You know why? Because when secularism has had its way, when secularism has dominated the minds of people, in the end, what will happen is it will leave a society bereft of shame. It will leave a society completely bereft of shame. That is what has happened in our time. There is a stridency to this thing now. There is a boldness to this thing now. I've often marveled, and I said 2 miracles took place in the showing of Mel Gibson's Passion. The first thing was that the liberals were troubled by too much of violence on the screen. And the second miracle that took place is that they actually believed that films can have an effect on you. Neither of which they ever wanted to admit to in peddling their own stuff. I want you to know what I'm saying here. There's a very thin line between that which is sacred and that which is profane. And if you profane that which is sacred, you plunder yourself. You rob yourself of that which was intended for delight and make yourself instead one who will become enslaved by monotony and boredom. Was it not Chesterton who said that emptiness does not come from being weary of pain, emptiness comes from being weary of pleasure? And what has happened here, when you see what secularization has done, it's gone on and on and on, and ultimately come to this point where we have produced a generation and a society bereft of shame. But there is a second mood, an even more dangerous mood that if it is not properly understood, it ends up becoming a very serious deformity in culture. In its positive form, we call it pluralization. Pluralization is a good thing. Pluralization is where there's a competing number of worldviews available to its members and no one worldview is dominant. Where there's a competing number of worldviews available to its members and no one worldview is dominant. And in a sense, in a world like this, how can you avoid the reality of pluralization? We must learn to accept it and wrestle with ideas in the marketplace, respecting the individual while engaging the idea, so that we keep people in their equality, but ideas in their hierarchy. Not all ideas are equal, and you must engage in a pluralistic culture. Now, pluralism has many sides to it. Was it not Peter Wagner from the Fuller School of World Mission who talked about pluralization in the 70s and gave it a very funny twist? He said, where else but in Los Angeles can you find a fast food outlet where a Korean is selling kosher tacos? That's pluralism. It's pluralism of cuisine. When I first came to Canada, I was in my 20s, and I remember desperately searching for an Indian restaurant. I wondered how a whole country could not be blessed with that, having an Indian restaurant there. And I searched and searched and finally found one. It was quite mediocre, made for an anglicized palate, but at least it had something to burn the tongue with for a few minutes and enjoy it a little bit. When I arrived in Toronto in 1966, I was just 20 at that time, there were 500 Indians in Toronto. So if you ever saw an Indian in Toronto, you'd cross the street to say hello. Today, there are 500,000 Indians in Toronto. And if you ever see an Anglo, you tend to cross the street to say, when did you get here? Toronto now has become the most multicultural city in the world. And you see the colors of complexion. You see the various cuisines. You hear the various accents. I always see myself as a citizen of the world. I love every continent. I actually do all of my writing in Asia. I don't write here because I like to think back from my Asian days. I go back to parts of Asia, and right from there, it somehow gets the genes working again within that context. So I love the cultures, the sounds, the languages. I love to learn other languages. I love to listen to other ideas. When I wrote the book, A Light in the Shadow of Jihad, I spent time with mullahs and sheikhs and Muslim clerics to understand what they have. In fact, I wrote it in a Muslim country. When I wrote The Lotus and the Cross, an imaginary conversation between Jesus and Gautama Buddha, I wrote it in Thailand and Malaysia so that I would be immersed within their own worldview and give the legitimate side of it, not a caricature of it. So I engage these things, I live with these things. But here's what I want to say to you. Two things. Number one, America was not framed by a pantheistic worldview. America could never have come into being in an Islamic worldview. I'm not saying this pejoratively or unkindly. I'm saying it descriptively. And no Muslim scholar has ever disagreed with me. He's agreed. Pantheism would not have generated the language of the founding documents. The Islamic worldview where life is very different, by the way, to here. For example, I remember somebody from the Islamic world telling me, if you draw a circle and a dot, and the dot represents one thing and the circle represents another thing. In America, if the circle represents life, a dot inside of it represents the faith or the religion. He said in the Islamic worldview, the circle represents religion and the dot represents life. Do you follow what I'm saying? It is completely reversed. The whole world is seen through the lens of the revelation of their prophet and the Sharia and law and all, from how you eat to how you go to the bathroom to when you fast to how you marry. All of those particularities are framed within that worldview. In Buddhism, it's the same thing. Hinduism is the same thing. That's why Hinduism sometimes doesn't even like to call itself a religion, likes to call itself a way of life. We in the West have forgotten the ideas that shaped this country. And here's what I want to say as a second thing, and that is this: that pluralism may be a good thing, but if it's extrapolated into meaning relativism, then you are on the knife edge of self-destruction. Hear what I'm saying? Pluralism is a good thing, but if it is extrapolated into moral relativism, then you're on the knife edge of destruction. Logic will tell you that. This is so important that we understand the nature of what it is that happens when a person lives a life that is systemically contradictory. And I hear these comments again and again and again on television or by the media. You hear such brazenly contradictory statements and you say to yourself, did this person ever have an introductory course in logic? Does this person understand what happens when you hold two mutually exclusive ideas that collide in actuality? I like to often say to you that what contradiction is to reason, sin is to life. If your life is embedded in sin, life breaks down. If your argument is contradictory, your argument breaks down. Now, at universities, it's not popular to talk about the law of non-contradiction anymore. In this postmodern world, where does this dinosaur come from who actually believes the laws of logic apply to reality? Let me give you an illustration. I can't do better than this, even though it happened years ago. Some of you may be familiar with it. But I remember speaking in California, which is quite a fascinating state, actually. You know, in all that's happening in relativism, some sociologists are talking about the Los Angelesization of the West. That's the term they are using, the Los Angelesization of the West. But this some years ago, and I was not quite knowing what I was going into. But I remember I was in the middle of the morning preparing my lecture, and the maid was in the room doing the bed, and she was fluffing up the pillow. And she says, "What kind of work do you do?" I said, "Well, I'm here to speak on some philosophical issues." She said, "Isn't that wonderful? I'm into metaphysics myself." said, wow, the pillow's being fluffed by somebody who's into metaphysics. I said, what did she mean? She probably meant that she's wrestling with ideas of very esoteric significance. That's what she meant. And in California, I'm sure that happens a lot. Now, I was speaking night after night, and an American professor who was teaching Hinduism at the local university and happened to have become a Hindu came to me and he said, I don't understand you. What is your ancestry? I said, well, my ancestors were Orthodox Hindu priests in the southern part of India. He said, and you're a Christian? I said, yeah. He said, how did that happen? So I started telling him, he says, I think it's a shame. I really think it's a shame. I said, and your ancestors? Yeah, they were Christian people. And I said, you're a Hindu? He said, yeah. I said, that's interesting. He said to me, I'd like to issue a challenge to you. Since I teach Eastern philosophy here, why don't you come back tomorrow night and speak on why you're not a Hindu, and I will bring my whole class, and after it's over, we'll tear you to shreds. Now, what kind of an invitation is that? And you just look at him and you say, that's a wonderful idea, let's do it. I can hardly wait till tomorrow evening comes. I looked at him and I said, no, thank you. I don't want to go for such an invitation. He said, I dare you to do it. I said, no, I'm not going to bite. I tried to humor him up. I said, when you throw mud at others, not only do you lose a lot of ground, but you get your hands dirty as well. He didn't think it was funny. He let it go. I said, I'll tell you what, I'll make a deal with you. I'll tell you why I am a Christian. I'm speaking on that one night. You bring your class and they can tear me apart after that. So, all right, okay, we'll do it. So he came at the end of my talk. In the middle of my talk, I was discussing the pantheistic, monistic worldview. And I said it was so systemically contradictory that you could take almost any statement about the nature of reality and find it in that worldview to be opposite to somebody else's statement, and they'd both be true. Mahatma Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan, who was India's leading Hindu philosopher, who held the chair of Eastern philosophies at Oxford University, and then later on became India's president. Dr. Radhakrishnan said you can be a theist, you can be an atheist, you can be a Muslim, you can be a Christian, you can be any one of these things and you can still be a Hindu. So when you start analyzing those statements, you find out he's equivocating on his terms. He's never really defined what a true Muslim is there. What a true Christian is there. He's just brought in a shade of meaning and said you can still be a Hindu at the same time. What he meant by that, who knows? But that's exactly what he says in his book, The Hindu View of Life. And as I talked about the contradiction after contradiction after contradiction, even quoted Mahatma Gandhi, who made the comment that there were some statements from the Vedas that he wished he could expunge completely. Not the least of which was the whole idea of the caste system. And at the end of it, he came to me and he said, you've done the greatest damage to this worldview I've ever heard any man do, and the reason is you don't understand it. I said, all right, sir, you may think I don't understand it. I'll be very happy to get a lecture from you on this. I said, but this is not the place, because we're not going to get into a verbal slugfest out here. But I tell you what, let's go out for lunch, and you and I will sit down across the table and we'll talk. And I pulled a Josh McDowell line on him. I said, you pay and I'll pray, and we'll have a great conversation that afternoon. He said, can I bring the professor of psychology with me? I said, fine, so long as you and I engage one-on-one. I said, I'm not interested in impressing anybody else. I want to hear what you tell me that I don't understand. So we got into this restaurant and we sat down, and he said, what you don't understand is the way logic works. I said, all right, tell me. He said, you see, there are two kinds of logic. Immediately he made a mistake. There's more than two kinds, but you don't stop a conversation so soon. So you let him go. He says there are two kinds of logic. He said, one is the law of non-contradiction. It is an either-or way of thinking. If you make a statement and somebody makes the opposite of it and it challenges this perspective to a counterpoint, then both of them can't be true, meaning the same thing at the same time. If you ask a question with one answer in mind and you get two contradictory answers, you have to assume that one of them has to be qualified or something has not been understood. If you don't believe me, try answering an immigration officer coming in to the country at this time in our national situation. Give him two contradictory answers and find out what happens. Try it in a law court and see what happens. So he says there is the law of non-contradiction, which is an either-or way of thinking. Either this or that. I often say if I'm walking with my wife and you stop both of us and you say to her, Margie, I hear you're expecting a baby. At the same time, if she says yes and I say no, will you think your question has been answered? You might say she hasn't told him yet. Or they need some family counseling, or something of the nature you'll say, both of these answers can't be right. Will one of you please explain it to me? That's the law of non-contradiction. At work, it's either or. And then he said this, it's the Western way of thinking. I said, no, that's a wrong line. He said, no, it's right. I said, it's wrong. He said, it's right. I said, it's wrong. He said, it's right. Went back and forth. I said, keep going. He said, then there is the both-hand way of thinking. It is not either this or that. It is the dialectical system, both this and that. So if you ask a Hindu, is God personal? And he says yes. And you ask another one, is he non-personal? And he says no. You don't have to qualify it. They're both right. He said this dialectic both-hand system is the Eastern way of thinking. By the way, this was the Hegelian idea. You take a thesis, it spawns its antithesis. You bring it together, it brings a synthesis. Karl Marx used that in his economic theory. You take the employer and then the employee, put them together, you get a classless society. Nobody ever shows you one, but the idea at least is there in theory. It is the dialectical both-hand system. And he said, that's the Eastern way of thinking. I said, no, it isn't. He said, yes, it is. I said, no, it isn't. He said, yes, it is. So I said, all right, keep going. He said, these are the two kinds of logic. The either-or, which is a Western way of thinking, and the both-hand, which is the Eastern way of thinking. He said, Ravi, you made a colossal blunder on that night. When you were discussing this Eastern worldview, you should have been using the both-hand system of logic, not the either-or. And then you would have been okay. If you'd seen contradiction after contradiction after contradiction, it wouldn't have worried you because that's the way the Easterners think. He picked up his knife and fork because he hadn't eaten yet. We'd finished ours. I pulled his placemat towards me and took his pen. In the middle, he had H or P or Hinduism or pantheism, whatever it is. And then he said, either or, both and. And he said, you should have been using the both-hand system of logic, not the either-or. I said, sir, I just have one question for you. What you're telling me is when I'm studying this worldview, I either use the both-hand system of logic or nothing else. Is that right? I either use the both-hand system or nothing else. Is that right? His knife and fork came down. It's one of the few times in my life I wished I'd had a cameraman there. And here's exactly what he said. The either-or does seem to emerge, doesn't it? I said, I got some shocking news for you. Even in India, you look both ways before you cross the street. It is either the bus or me, not both of us. And the professor of psychology smiled and said, I think this discussion is over. We may as well go home now. Do you see what he was doing? He was using the either-or with which to prove the both-and. So it's got nothing to do with whether it's Eastern or Western. It is that which best represents reality. In fact, he did not even recognize what I pointed out to him, that Shankara, the leading proponent of the pantheistic monistic worldview, debated people to argue them into his way of thinking. Gautama Buddha did the same thing. Buddha was a debater. Shankara was a debater. These men engaged the opposite ideas in order to pronounce them false as compared to theirs. And they were reasonable in that underpinning of assumption. And so when you live with this whole idea of that which is mutually contradictory, that which does not take into consideration the laws of logic and the laws of reason, you end up with a worldview that implodes under the weight of contradiction. That is the weight America is living with now. We talk about unalienable rights. What do we mean? How can a quantity that is a product of random chance have moral rights? How can we talk against racism if we do not believe in essential dignity? You follow what I'm saying? It was the philosophers Nietzsche who were putting this thing to a lie and said equality is a concoction of modern man. There is no such thing as equality. We cannot live with this herd mentality. And they looked for the Superman, the domination of the weaker by the stronger, because that's the way nature has done it. Chesterton, in one of his books, says this about those who rebel against all moral authority and want relativism to be holding sway over all of our thinking. Chesterton says this: the new rebel today is a skeptic and will not entirely trust anything. He has no loyalty, therefore he can never be a true revolutionist. And the fact that he doubts everything really gets in his way when he wants to denounce anything. For all denunciation implies a moral doctrine of some kind, and the modern revolutionist doubts not only the institution he denounces, but the doctrine by which he denounces it. Thus he writes one book complaining that imperial oppression insults the purity of women. Then he writes another book, a novel, in which he insults it himself. He curses the Sultan because Christian girls lose their virginity, then curses Mrs. Grundy because they keep it. As a politician, he cries out that war is a waste of life. Then as a philosopher, that life itself is a waste of time. A Russian pessimist will denounce a policeman for killing a peasant and then prove by the highest philosophical principles that the peasant ought to have killed himself. A man denounces marriage as a lie, then denounces aristocratic profligates for treating it as a lie. He calls the flag a bauble, then blames the oppressors of Poland or Ireland because they take away that bauble. The man of this school goes first to a political meeting where he complains that savages are treated as if they were beasts. Then he takes his hat and umbrella and goes on to a scientific meeting where he proves that they practically are beasts. In short, the modern revolutionist, being an infinite skeptic, is always engaged in undermining his own minds. In his book on politics, he attacks men for trampling on morality. In his book on ethics, he attacks morality for trampling on men. Therefore, the modern man in revolt has become practically useless for all purposes of revolt. By rebelling against everything, he has lost his right to rebel against anything. Do you hear what I'm saying? By rebelling against everything, he's lost his right to rebel against anything. You see, Chesterton goes on to say that the tragedy of disbelieving in God is not that a person ends up believing in nothing. Alas, it is much worse. That person may end up believing in anything. You know, once upon a time, Immanuel Kant told us that we could, unconfronted by God, use reason by which we may arrive at a moral basis. Reason will lift us there. Reason will secure us there. Iris Murdoch, the philosopher, had a marvelous response. I have it here. She says, how recognizable, how familiar to us is this man so beautifully portrayed in the groundwork by Kant, who, confronted even with Christ, turns away to consider the judgment of his own conscience and to hear the voice of his own reason. Ah, this man who is with us still, free, independent, lovely, powerful, rational, responsible, brave, the hero of so many novels and books of moral philosophy. The raison d'etre of this attractive but misleading creature is not far to seek. He is the offspring of the age of science, confidently rational and yet increasingly aware of his alienation from the material universe which his discoveries reveal. His alienation is without cure. It is not such a long step from Kant to Nietzsche to existentialism and the Anglo-Saxon ethical doctrines which now in some ways closely resemble it. In fact, Immanuel Kant's man had already received a glorious incarnation nearly a century earlier in the work of Milton. His proper name is Lucifer. Knowledge is a deadly friend when no one sets the rules. The fate of all mankind, I see, is in the hands of fools. Confusion will be my epitaph as I crawl a cracked and broken path. If we make it, we can all sit back and laugh, but I'm afraid tomorrow I'll be crying. So says the rock musician. We had better find out in our own mind these marvelous terms that sound so good. Pluralization, it's a great idea. But let me tell you, if it's extrapolated into relativism, a culture cannot survive. So secularization leads to no shame. Pluralization leads to no reason, which leads me to my final thought, privatization. Privatization is what? Where there's a breakdown in the modern experience between the public and the private sphere, and we are forced to find meaning in the private. This is a terrifying reality of our time. We are muzzled. I was in Doha, Qatar, 3 weeks ago, speaking to our troops there, and the day before, my wife, my colleague, and some of my buddies were with me. We were going through the new university campuses in Doha that the Sheikha, the Sheikh's first wife, is involved in building for her people. Cornell has a campus there. Texas A&M has a campus there. Carnegie Mellon has a campus there. The Virginia School of Art, state-of-the-art campus, is magnificent. She wants to educate her young people, and those university campuses are packed. And to see young people coming in and everything that you want in contemporary education they have, some of them far ahead of any of our universities here in terms of technology, in real time listening to lecturers from Texas or from Ithaca or wherever it is. And you know what I noticed? In every one of those buildings, there were built prayer rooms for the students. I may not agree with that worldview, but they're being consistent with what they believe. Try getting that kind of permission in our universities today. Here we believe religion is an amputation of the brain. We've severed it. And you know what? The more educated we get, apart from moral absolutes and a continuation of private and public life, the more we will train intellectually sophisticated people. And in the words of Huxley, he says this: we are living today not in the delicious intoxication of the early successes of science, rather in the grisly morning after, where it has become quite apparent that what science may have actually done is to introduce us to improved means in order to obtain hitherto unimproved or rather deteriorated ends. Now, I don't think for a moment he'd be knocking the sciences. They are great disciplines. We need them. We need the best scientific minds in our time to harness that which we can use for the benefit of man. But if we do it without any moral fiber, then our means become great, our ends become damnable. And we lose the most valuable thing in the world in the process, truth. See, here's it. What is it you really look for in life? I've found this all over the world as I go. I've lectured in about over 50 countries, and I've been in campuses of every stripe and worldview. And when it is all over, you get some student who'll come to you and say, "Can I talk to you alone?" I've had it happen in India. I've had it happen in Jordan. I've had it happen at Oxford. Had it happen at Harvard. You name them. And somebody says, "Can I talk to you alone?" And they look you in the eye and say, "How do I keep from taking my own life?" Because we've fragmented their lives. University means bringing unity and diversity. How can we bring unity and diversity if we do not see the essential sacredness of life itself? It's a pursuit we desperately need. That's why our coins say, "E pluribus unum," out of the many one. Unless we recognize the soulishness of human beings, that inner reality, where we understand each other's hurts, where we understand each other's wounds and understand each other's struggles. You know, every culture ultimately speaks from the agony of its wounds. Go to Russia today, you'll hear that. Go to India today, you'll hear that. Go to the Middle East today, you'll hear that. And how can you privatize your most valuable belief? When you say, keep it to your private life, don't bring it into your public life. When I was going to the University of Delhi in my teens in India, I never ever objected to my classmates who'd come straight from the temple and the mark of ash on their forehead. It was understood that their private life and their public life had a connection. Why is it in the Christian faith we think we can break it up and tell the Christian to keep his worldview private? We're doing this at our own damage, to our own damage. And what happens when privatization has run its course? You end up without meaning. Secularization, no shame. Pluralization, no reason. Privatization, no meaning. An existentialist philosopher writes a story of a man and his wife who come into town one day. She'd never been into the big city. And he says to her, "Why don't you look around the shops? I'll go and do my business. We'll meet here at the end of the day. Go to a hotel, check in for the night. We'll have a lovely dinner, have the night here, go back tomorrow." She says, "Okay." He goes. She starts pondering as she looks at the streets. She starts thinking of a dream she had as a teenager. Doesn't tell us what. It was a sensuous dream. But she didn't know how she could fulfill it without being in trouble with her husband, and if it were ever found out. So ambivalent, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. She struggles till the day's gone. He picks her up. They go back to the hotel. They have a lovely dinner. Go to bed. He falls asleep right away. She's lying there wide awake thinking, can I enjoy this still? While he's sound asleep, slips out of the room, gets changed, goes out into the night, and in the words of the writer, enjoys the lust of the night, comes back, gets changed, slips into bed, puts the head on the covers, and now she's feeling very different to what she was before. The eyes well up with tears. The tears start to come down the side of her face. There's a voice of self-rejection creeping up within her. And all of a sudden she sits up and sobs uncontrollably. And the husband wakes up and startled says to her, "What's the matter? What's the matter?" She pushes him away and says, "Nothing, just nothing." In grand existential anticlimax, the story ends where you and I may make the inference legitimately that the loneliest moment in life is when you have experienced that which you thought would deliver the ultimate, but it's let you down. It happens again and again and again. If you're looking for absolutes for culture, pure secularism will not take you there. Relativism will not take you there. Privatization will not take you there. You must look to the answer that goes beyond this world. Because seculum in Latin literally means this worldly. You need that transcendent perspective. Let me take 5 minutes and close with this. Jesus, when he was tempted of the devil in the wilderness, has a remarkable encounter. T.S. Eliot, I think, says these temptations were the greatest treason to do the right thing for the wrong reason. When the tempter says to him, why don't you turn these stones into bread and the world will follow you? Jesus says, no. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Ladies and gentlemen, ultimately you're not material, you're spiritual. The temptation to think that if you had all the bread in the world you wanted, you'd be okay is a deception. It doesn't happen. Some of the highest rates of suicide in the world are in the most prosperous countries. And then he says to him, why don't you jump and see if the angels will give charge over you and protect you? And he says, no, you shall not tempt the Lord your God. What he's really saying is, you can't use God as a kind of a slot machine for your life. And then finally he says, I'll give you all this world if you will bow down and worship me. And Jesus says, be gone. You shall worship the Lord your God alone, and him only shall you serve. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're looking for an absolute, you will only find it when all of the diversity within you is bound up together in the coherence of the worship of the living God, who is the truth. Here it is. Here it is. Archbishop William Temple said, worship is the submission of all of our nature to God. It's the quickening of conscience by his holiness, nourishment of mind by his truth, purifying of imagination by his beauty, opening of the heart to his love, and submission of will to his purpose. All this gathered up together is the greatest expression of which we are capable. What William Temple is saying is, the diversities of your life, if they move into an angular form for the monopolization of your life with one angle, you will find yourself fragmented and never find coherence within. There has to be a worldview that binds these diversities into the unity, and that only comes in worship. That's why the moral law gives us our absolutes. Where life is sacred, your word is sacred, your property is sacred, your relationships are sacred, your time is sacred, sexuality is sacred. By the desacralization of these things, you lose the absolute and fragmentation begins within. Go back across 6 centuries. When the Renaissance was in full swing, man became an artistic being. Then Descartes and others came to do their thing. Man became a rational being. Then comes Hume and Kant. From empiricism to skepticism, man became a skeptical being. On the heels of all of that come the existentialists, and man becomes sort of that volitional or desperate being. Till you come down to postmodernism today, and man, in a sense, becomes a defining being or a non-being, whichever extreme of the pendular swing you go to. And we end up in the deluge all over again, because rather than allowing God to define, we do the defining, and the deluge comes. The aesthetes were partially right in the Renaissance. Art has a legitimate place. Cartesian method and reason and all of that had a legitimate place. The empiricists were partly right. Empiricism has its legitimate place. The existentialists were right. The will has a legitimate place. The emotions have. And you come all the way down through this one after another, and I say to you, only God blends the aesthetic, the rational, the empirical, the existential, and puts it together and says to you, that I have fashioned you in my image. And when you worship him with honor, everything is joined. You become the best scientist you can be. You become the best philosopher you can be, because there's a transcending reason for your being, and everything else fits into that big picture. That's what culture needs. When I spoke at the University of Iowa and gave the definition that Yankelevich gave, that we look for a coherent set of answers to the existential questions that confront all of us in the passage of our lives, a woman shouted at me and said, "Who ever told you life needed to be coherent?" She said, is this another one of those Western things you're dominating us with? Who told you that? So she went on and on. I said, I'll answer your question if you can help me. When my answer comes to you, do you want my answer to be coherent or may my answer be incoherent? She stepped back. The wrong side of incoherence is very painful. The right side of coherence gives meaning. Search of absolutes, only God is that eternally coherent being who gives us our definitions. May we find it in him. Thank you so much for being so patient. We'll give you a couple minutes and then we'll answer questions.